In the bleak winter of 1873, hushed whispers drifted like snowflakes through the German immigrant quarter of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They all spoke of one name, Elise Kunig. Just 11 years old, this pale, eerily silent child had become the source of both wonder and dread. Elise could tell you the day of the week for any date in recorded history within seconds. She could repeat full conversations word for word after hearing them only once. She could walk through her neighborhood blindfolded and still tell you the number of steps between every building with chilling precision. Today, we might label Elise's condition as an extraordinary neurological anomaly. But in 1873, it was either seen as the touch of the divine or something far more unholy. At first, the townsfolk marveled at her talents. But admiration gave way to fear when Elise began using her abilities to reveal buried truths, secrets, long forgotten sins hidden beneath respectable facades. She whispered warnings before fatal accidents, described crimes no living witness should have known, and recited names best left buried. By the time the spring thaw arrived, 3 men would be dead. 1 family would vanish into the night, and Elise Kunig herself would disappear, leaving behind only a worn leather journal filled with a sequence of numbers no one dared to decipher. Before we continue unraveling the dark and haunting mystery of Elise Kunig and the secrets she unearthed in Milwaukee's German Quarter, don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Tap the bell so you never miss our weekly dive into the strangest corners of the past. And let us know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? These stories, after all, don't just belong to dusty books. They happened in neighborhoods like yours. What the residents of Brewery Town didn't yet understand was that Elise's gift would soon unravel a decade-long tapestry of betrayal, silence, and blood. Her precise mind would become the town's most terrifying curse. Milwaukee's German Quarter in 1873 was alive with industry and tradition. Rows of red brick breweries loomed over quiet wooden homes. The air smelled of malt and chimney smoke, pierced by a steady hum of German and English voices overlapping in the winter chill. Nearly 8,000 immigrants from Bavaria and beyond had carved out a world of their own here, with beer gardens, bread ovens, and Bavarian customs transported to the edge of Lake Michigan. Among them were Matthias and Elise Kunig, who had sailed from Bavaria in 1861 with nothing but hope, 2 strong hands, and their newborn daughter. Matthias found work as a brewmaster at the Faber & Sons Brewery, a respected mid-sized operation supplying ale to Milwaukee's thirsty working class. Annalise earned extra coins by mending clothes and taking in laundry, her needle dancing long into the night by candlelight, while little Elise slept in their small, neat home on Gellner Street. By all accounts, the Kunigs were entirely unremarkable. Humble, hardworking, devout. All except for their daughter. Elise had been born mid-ocean during a brutal Atlantic storm. She arrived 3 weeks early, so fragile and silent that even the ship's doctor doubted she would survive. But survive she did, small and pale, with haunting grey eyes that seemed too knowing for their age. As a toddler, Elise never cried. She rarely played. She simply watched, eyes wide head, tilted lips closed. Adults often found themselves uneasy under her gaze. By the age of 4, the first signs emerged. Elise began to repeat conversations she had overheard days earlier, word for word, with the exact tone and accent of the speakers. She noticed everything. The number of stitches in her mother's embroidery, the steps between their house and the bakery, the rhythm of the brewery whistles that marked each working day. When Matthias began teaching her basics arithmetic, he quickly found himself outpaced. She could solve complex problems in her head before he'd even finished writing them down. But as you'll soon see, genius, especially in a child, is not always a blessing. Sometimes it's a warning. At first, Milwaukee's tight-knit German enclave regarded Elise Kunig's strange talents with a blend of quiet pride and creeping unease. Some called her a miracle, others a warning. Mrs. Brannigan, the town's oldest widow, who often claimed her grandmother had witnessed the final years of the Würzburg witch trials, would clutch her rosary and murmur a prayer every time Elise's storm-grey eyes landed on her. But not all saw her as something to be feared. Father Corner, the stout and good-natured Bavarian priest who presided over the modest stone church at the heart of Brewery Town, declared Elise's gifts a divine signal. A child touched by heaven, he'd say here, to remind us that God's wisdom follows us even into the new world. But winter in Milwaukee that year cared little for divinity. The winter of 1872 was the harshest in living memory. The bitter cold carved ice onto window panes from the inside. Lake Michigan froze solid a feet, not seen in a generation. In the breweries, workers clustered around stuttering coal stoves, their breath misting in the air like ghosts. At home, their wives rationed soup, patched threadbare blankets, and prayed the frost wouldn't take their youngest before morning. And it was during this cold and stifled season that Elise's gifts began to shift. What had once been strange, even charming, became quietly disturbing. She spent her days perched on a wooden chair beside the kitchen window, chin resting on the sill, grey eyes scanning the snowy street like a silent sentinel. Her gaze followed every neighbor, every movement, with the same intensity she once gave to numbers on a chalkboard. But now, she wasn't just counting anymore. She was noticing. Mr. Krell, who worked at the main brewery, walked the exact same route each morning, 247 steps, except on Wednesdays when he'd detour past the butcher and take 284. Mrs. Fessler hung her laundry in a precise order sheets, then shirts, then aprons, but reversed it entirely on nights. Her husband came home late from the mill. At first, these quirks were shared by Elise as idle observations at dinner, curious facts, the way a child might recite how many birds were in the trees that morning. But as the snow deepened and February settled in, her tone changed. The facts turned into forecasts, and everything changed on a grey morning in early 1873. Elise was seated at the kitchen table, mechanically eating her porridge. Her mother, Annalise, was packing a lunch pail for Matthias when Elise looked up, eyes cold and distant. "Mr. Dawn won't come home today," she said softly. "He'll be dead by exactly 14 minutes past 2. The tin lunchbox slipped from Annalise's hands with a clatter. "Elise," she gasped. "God help us, what an awful thing to say. Why would you say such a thing?" Elise didn't flinch. Her grey eyes never left her mother's face. "He's been drinking from the small brown bottle for 17 days. Yesterday he drank 3 times more than usual. His steps 251 instead of his usual 244. A 12% deviation. When someone changes their pattern by more than 10%, something irreversible happens within 72 hours. It's a simple calculation." Matthias, halfway through fastening his wool coat, froze. Johann Dawn was a known drinker, but no worse than half the men in the district. The notion that Elise had been silently tracking his consumption and his walking pattern was chilling. But it wasn't the statistics that unnerved them. It was her certainty. Elise Matthias said sternly, "You must not speak of death like that. You're a child, and it's not your place." She nodded once and returned to her breakfast as though the matter were settled. But it wasn't. Not for her parents. They shared a glance over her lowered head, a glance thick with unspoken worry. They had accepted their daughter's strangeness, but this felt like something else. Not intelligence, not quirk, not even instinct. It felt like a warning. At exactly 2:13 that afternoon, Johann Dorn collapsed in the malt room of Faber & Sons brewery. The cause, heart failure. Dr. Mersch recorded it as the final blow from long-term alcohol poisoning. But that's not what the neighbors talked about. They talked about the girl who had seen it coming. Not guessed, not feared. Calculated, and it wouldn't be the last time. The men who found Johann Dorn in the brewery's malt room said they'd noticed changes in him for weeks. Heavier drinking, a nervous edge in his laughter, and emptiness behind the eyes. But what truly unnerved them wasn't the decline itself. It was the timing. Elise Kunig's prediction had been correct, not just in spirit, but to the minute. News of her airy prophecy spread through the German quarter like chimney smoke on a still night, curling under doors, seeping into every household. Some neighbors shook their heads and called it coincidence, but others remembered the pale child by the kitchen window, the girl with the silent stare and ticking mind. They began to wonder what else she had seen, what secrets she might have harvested from their private routines. The Kunig family, once overlooked in the humdrum rhythm of brewery town, now felt the weight of stares. At church, at the market, even passing on the street, hushed voices fell silent as they approached. Smiles grew tighter. Greetings less warm. Even Father Connor, who had once proudly proclaimed Elise's mind a divine marvel, now appeared less certain. After Sunday Mass, Matthias pulled the priest aside near the old stone steps, searching for guidance. "Father," he said softly, "there's been something troubling." "You heard what she said before dawn passed." Father Connor's genial face stiffened his thick Bavarian accent, more serious than usual. "My friend," he said, lowering his voice, "perhaps it would be best if young Elise spent less time watching and more time praying." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "Yes, the Lord gives gifts. But the devil also takes delight in twisting what is innocent. Even knowledge can become temptation." The words sat uneasily with Matthias, a man of fermentation tanks, not angels and demons. But as much as he disliked superstition, he couldn't deny the precision of Elise's prediction. It hadn't been instinct. It hadn't been fear. It had been math. That evening, with the oil lamp burning low, he sat across from Elise at the kitchen table. "Elise," he said quietly, "you need to tell me the truth. How did you know about Mr. Dorner?" She looked up with those enormous grey eyes, calm, empty of emotion, all calculation. "I observe," she said. "I count. I remember." Mr. Dorn changed his patterns in predictable ways. His alcohol intake increased by 37% across 17 days. His food consumption dropped by about 20%. That kind of imbalance creates cardiac risk. I estimated the most likely failure window based on his age, weight, and behavior. 14 minutes past 2 was the most probable time. Matthias felt a coldness crawl into his chest. His daughter was 11. But she spoke like a medical examiner, or something even colder. "Elise," he asked, trying to sound gentle, "how could you possibly know all that about Mr. Dawn's food and drink?" His steps, his weight. She didn't blink. "I observe everyone, Papa. Every day, every person, every pattern." There was no malice in her voice, just data. But behind her steady eyes was something that made Matthias recoil. "Would you like me to tell you the other calculations I've made?" she asked. "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. "No, Elise. That's enough." He didn't want to know what other quiet equations had formed inside her head. He didn't want to hear what probabilities she'd assigned to the people they prayed with, traded bread with, sat beside in church. That night, as he tucked her into bed, her small body beneath layers of wool and quilts, he stared down at her and felt a chill settle deep into his bones. There was a darkness pressing at the edges of their little house, a darkness not born of evil, but of knowing too much. Outside, February snow blanketed the streets, muffling sound and cloaking the world in quiet. Inside, Elise lay still, eyes closed. Her mind spinning through variables, anomalies and patterns, calculating things that no child should calculate. In the days and weeks after Johann Dawn's death, the tone of Brewery Town changed as if the wind off Lake Michigan had shifted, carrying something colder than frost. Elise continued her window watch. She tracked, counted, logged the behavior of everyone who passed beneath her eyes. But now her parents watched her too, the way one might watch a fire flickering too close to the drapes. The Kunigs had once seen Elise as their miracle. Now she was something else entirely. Something harder to name. Something far more difficult to love. And in a tight-knit brewing community where lives were interwoven like threads in an old wool blanket, Elise Kunig had become a thread no one knew how to touch. In Brewery Town, lives were intertwined like the seams of an old wool coat, fraying but familiar. The men relied on one another for shifts and wages, the women for warmth and quiet understanding. Through long winters, and the children ran freely through narrow alleys, inventing games between the red brick buildings. But Elise Kunig never quite belonged to that pattern. While the other children chased hoops, swapped sweets, and spun tales of ships and soldiers, Elise sat apart, silent, still counting, calculating, watching. And as winter turned to early spring, Annalise began to notice that her daughter's observations were becoming more detailed and more disturbing. One evening, as she kneaded dough, Elise casually remarked, "Mrs. Worth has been meeting with Mr. Kyle behind the brewery every Tuesday afternoon. 6 weeks now." Annalisa froze. "Elise, how could you possibly know that?" Elise didn't look up. She spoke with the cool detachment of someone reading from a ledger. People pretend to keep secrets, but they move in patterns. Mrs. Worth tells her husband she's visiting her sister, but the road to her sister's house is 349 steps. She only walks 127. That path leads to Mr. Kale's. On another day, Elise mentioned the Schneider family, saying they buried objects in their back garden every Sunday after church. They bury them 73 centimeters apart, in a grid, always wrapped in cloth. I measured the pattern from the upstairs window. They think no one sees, but I do. Annalisa was no longer shocked. She was afraid. One morning in March, as Elise carefully buttered a slice of black bread, she said, "People think they are secret, but they follow patterns just like numbers." That night, after Elise was asleep and the house had fallen quiet under a blanket of snowfall, Matthias sat at the kitchen table, jaw clenched tight. "This can't go on," he said. "She's not just different. She's unnatural, Annalise. A child shouldn't observe such things. She shouldn't speak of them like this coldly, like she's charting rainfall." His wife nodded, her hands trembling as she mended his work shirt. "I'm frightened, Matthias, not of Elise, of what comes next. The neighbors already look at us sideways. Mrs. Brannigan crossed the street yesterday to avoid me. And Father Connor? He hasn't visited since Johann died. Her fears would soon prove justified." 3 days later, Elise made another one of her unsettling announcements. She was helping peel potatoes for supper when she suddenly stopped, her hands, still, her eyes distant. "Mrs. Worth will be discovered tomorrow," she said flatly. "At exactly 11 o'clock. Her husband will find her with Mr. Cale in the brewery office. There will be violence." Annalisa dropped the paring knife. "Elise, no. That's a cruel thing to say. You mustn't speak like this." But Elise's tone didn't change. She explained methodically, as though answering a question on an exam. "Mrs. Worth has arrived at the brewery 7 minutes earlier each week for 6 weeks. Mr. Cale now stays 33 minutes later each day. Tomorrow, Mr. Worth will return 47 minutes early from his delivery route. His horse is developing lameness in her front left leg. I've observed her gait worsening for 11 days. From the doorway, Matthias stood motionless, dread rising in his throat. "Elise, how do you know about Mr. Worth's horse?" he asked. "I count her steps when she passes our house," she replied. On March 1st, she favored her right side 53% of the time. Today it was 68%. Tomorrow she will slow the route enough for him to arrive back 47 minutes early. The timing aligns with the others. The convergence is certain. Neither parent spoke. What could they say to a child who spoke like a clockmaker about the collapse of lives? The next morning came like any other. But by 11 o'clock, word spread through the narrow streets. Wilhelm Wirth had returned early from his route. He found his wife Anna in a compromising position with Ernst Keil, the brewery's owner, in the back office. What followed wasn't whispered, it was shouted, broken, bleeding. And Elise, from the kitchen window, simply watched. The men of the quarter relied on one another for work, their wives for comfort during long winters, and their children filled the narrow alleys between red brick buildings with laughter. But one child stood apart. Emma never fit into the woven rhythms of that community. While others played hopscotch or shared silly stories, she sat silently on stoops or behind curtains, counting, always counting and watching. She watched with a precision that unsettled even the most grounded adults. At first, her observations had seemed innocent enough, but Greta began to notice a shift. Emma's remarks were growing darker. She would casually mention that Mrs. Wessler had been meeting secretly with Mr. Kellerman behind the brewery every Tuesday afternoon for precisely 6 weeks, or that the Schneider family had been burying something behind their garden shed after Sunday service. Always in a cloth, always 73 centimeters apart. Greta tried to dismiss it. How could she possibly know? She whispered to herself. When pressed, Emma simply replied, "I calculate." People think they are secret, but they move like numbers, predictable. It was a grey March morning when Emma calmly said it aloud at the breakfast table. As she buttered her toast, Mrs. Wessler tells her husband she's visiting her sister. But she takes 127 steps east to Mr. Kellerman's door, not 349 to her sister's. Hinrich had heard enough. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, he sat with Greta, hands shaking slightly, as he folded one of his work shirts. "This isn't right," he murmured. "Children shouldn't see these things, and certainly not speak of them like that." Greta nodded, her face pale. "I'm not frightened of her, Hinrich. I'm frightened of what people will say. They already look at us strangely. Mrs. Baumer crossed the street when I passed her yesterday, and Father Koller he hasn't visited since Jan's funeral." Their unease turned to dread 3 days later. Emma was helping in the kitchen, peeling potatoes in even measured slices when she paused and looked up. "Mrs. Wessler will be discovered tomorrow. At 11 a.m., her husband will catch her and Mr. Kellerman in the brewery office. There will be violence." Greta dropped her knife. "Emma, no. That is not something to say." But the child continued, her voice flat as a chalkboard calculation. "Mrs. Wessler has been arriving at the brewery 7 minutes earlier every week. Mr. Kellerman has been staying 33 minutes later. And Mr. Wessler's horse, she has a developing lameness in her front leg. She'll slow tomorrow's delivery route by 47 minutes. That's just enough time for him to return early. Discovery is inevitable." Hinrich had been listening from the door. "Emma," he asked quietly, "how do you know about the horse?" She turned her head without blinking. "I count her gait when she passes. On March 1st, she favored her right legs 53% of the time. Today it was 68%. Tomorrow the strain will be visible, and the next day unfolded exactly as Emma predicted. Wilhelm Wessler returned early and discovered his wife entangled with brewery owner Ernst Kellerman in the back office. The confrontation was violent. Kellerman was left with a broken nose and 3 cracked ribs. Anna Wessler, bruised and bloodied, had to be carried home. Dr. Müller was summoned. But more than the violence, it was the whispered truth behind it that chilled the neighborhood Emma Richter had known. Not guessed, not gossiped, known. By sundown, the whispers had grown teeth. Emma's name rippled across the German quarter like smoke. First they said she'd predicted Jan Dietrich's accident. Now this. Some called her cursed. Others called her gifted, but almost everyone called her dangerous. Children were pulled away from her path. Friends stopped visiting. At church, the Richters sat alone. The shopkeepers, once warm, now handed them goods with tight smiles and even tighter eyes. Ernst Kellerman, still bandaged and humiliated, made it clear Hinrich's presence at the brewery was unwelcome. And yet, Emma seemed untouched. Each morning she sat at the window, watching, calculating. She began to carry a small leather journal always with her. Greta once tried to peek inside, but the columns of symbols and equations gave her a headache. Diagrams, behavioral timelines, even maps of the neighborhood with strange codes scrawled in the margins. Her parents tried not to look, because what they did see was enough. By spring, the air warmed, but the fear only deepened. The German quarter had become a village of glances and silence. Hinrich, broken-hearted, began to consider leaving it all behind. Milwaukee, the community, everything. But Emma wasn't done. In fact, she had already begun to calculate something worse, something darker. Her journal grew thicker each day. The equations she wrote had started to stretch beyond even what Greta could recognize as arithmetic. There were rhythm charts, behavior maps, even projected collapse events she wouldn't explain. The whispers became rules. Children weren't allowed to pass near the Richter house. Shopkeepers no longer lingered for conversation. Father Kohler kept his distance. And yet, Emma's mind only seemed to sharpen. It was then that Dr. Friedrich Müller, the community physician, decided to intervene not out of fear, but out of curiosity. He wasn't like the others. Educated in Berlin, he had once studied rare mental conditions and knew that genius could look like madness when misunderstood. When Henrik finally approached him in quiet desperation, Dr. Müller agreed to examine Emma. It happened on a rainy Thursday morning in the rooms above Müller's pharmacy on Water Street. Emma didn't flinch. She answered every question with an eerie precision, reciting timelines, measurements, even Müller's own medical routines. Her eyes didn't wander. They remained fixed, locked on some invisible axis, calmly orbiting the unknown. In the days that followed, the fire was the only topic of conversation in the German quarter. But it wasn't the tragedy itself that dominated whispers in bakeries and behind drawn curtains. It was the girl. The quiet child with the distant eyes who had somehow known what was going to happen. The authorities chalked it up to poor maintenance and drunken negligence. But within the community, suspicion took root and spread like the flames that had gutted the Zimmerman house. Some began to mutter that Emma wasn't just seeing danger, she was inviting it. That she was no longer merely a brilliant observer, but something far darker. At church, the stares became colder. Neighbors who once offered polite nods now crossed the street to avoid the Richters entirely. Even Greta's few remaining friends began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be near the child who seemed to sit outside time, watching with eyes that missed nothing. Henrik, tormented by guilt, tried to reassure his wife. She saved lives, he insisted. If we hadn't said anything more, families might have died. But Greta didn't answer. She sat in the dark with her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the flickering shadows from the oil lamp, as if afraid to speak her fears aloud. Dr. Müller returned once more, this time unannounced. He'd read accounts of prodigious savants' cases where mathematical genius was tied to deep social detachment or neurological divergence. But Emma was different. It wasn't just her intellect. It was the specificity, the coldness. He asked to see her journal again, and after some hesitation, Emma handed it over. This time, there were timelines, projected, dates cross-referenced with names, locations, even street corners. Under one section marked May-June, he noticed several entries circled in red ink. One of them read simply, Schmidt infant, June 12th, suffocation, unattended. Müller's blood ran cold. He closed the book gently and asked Emma, "Do you understand what these predictions mean, Emma? That they are real people?" Emma nodded without emotion. "Yes, but the data has no moral alignment. The numbers only describe what is likely to happen." Müller stared at her, uncertain whether he was speaking to a gifted child or a mind slipping beyond humanity. "What if you're wrong?" Emma tilted her head. "Then I revised the model. That night, Dr. Muller met privately with Father Koller. Though he prided himself on science, the doctor felt something deeply unnatural was unfolding in the Richter home. Something his instruments and textbooks could not quantify. The priest listened with grave silence, nodding slowly. "I've known something was off," he murmured, "ever since the Kellner affair." The two men agreed to keep a watchful eye on the family, though for different reasons. Muller feared a psychological crisis. Father Koller feared something far older, something ancient, cloaked in numbers and logic. As June approached, tension in the community escalated. Emma had withdrawn almost entirely into her journal. The pages were now filled with what looked like codes, long strings of numbers, geographic coordinates, and what appeared to be weather data. But beneath the surface of these figures was something more, a growing list of names. Some were crossed out, others weren't. The Richters could no longer pretend their daughter was simply gifted. Whatever was happening in Emma's mind, it had begun to shape the world around her. And for Milwaukee's German quarter, the worst was yet to come. Greta dropped the bread dough onto the table and rushed to the front door, not even stopping to grab her shawl. She didn't entirely believe what Emma had said couldn't, but some instinct deeper than logic propelled her forward. The air outside was cool and sharp, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the narrow street. She turned toward the river. As Greta hurried down the cobblestones, a few neighbors watched from behind curtains, their eyes filled with the same mix of fear and curiosity that had followed her family for weeks now. But Greta didn't care. All she could think about was Mrs. Brennan, a widow who had quietly endured years of solitude after losing her husband to a dockyard accident. A woman who baked for church events, who hummed softly while hanging laundry. A woman who perhaps had decided no one was watching closely enough to stop her from slipping away. Greta found her just in time. Mrs. Brennan was standing at the edge of the riverbank, her hands clenched in front of her eyes, staring into the water. Greta didn't yell. She didn't run. She just walked slowly, gently, until she was beside her and reached out to take her hand. They stood there for several minutes, neither speaking. Eventually, Mrs. Brennan let out a long, shuddering breath and allowed Greta to guide her back toward the street. No one said a word about the incident the next day, but it was understood that something had nearly happened and that Greta Richter had stopped it. That night, after Mrs. Brennan had been quietly returned home and Father Koller had visited her for prayer, Greta stood in the doorway of Emma's room, watching her daughter right by lamplight. "You knew," she said softly. Emma didn't look up. "I noticed a deviation." Greta stepped into the room. "Is that all this is to you? Patterns, deviations? Are you even worried when something terrible is about to happen?" Emma paused. "Then worry is inefficient. It clouds analysis." Greta sat down heavily on the bed. "Emma, I want to help you. I want to understand. But sometimes you talk like you're not my daughter anymore. Like you're a system Emma finished for her. I think like a system. But I'm still me. I remember when you taught me to tie my shoes. I remember the smell of Papa's jacket. I just don't need to think about those things to make decisions." Tears welled in Greta's eyes. "But I need to see those things in you. I need to know that you feel something when you see someone in pain." Emma looked up, finally meeting her mother's eyes. "I feel something, but it's not the same as you. It's not warm, it's structural. Like knowing where a crack will form before it happens. In that moment, Greta understood something terrifying. Emma wasn't cruel. She wasn't cold. But whatever was growing in her mind, whatever architecture of logic and numbers had taken root there, it was changing the meaning of emotion, the function of human relationships. Emma was still her daughter, but she was becoming something else too. And as the days ticked toward summer, that transformation was accelerating. She dropped the bread dough. It hit the counter with a dull thud as Greta ran from the kitchen apron, still dusted in flour. Out back, Henrik was bent over the early spring soil, coaxing order and purpose from the thawing earth, one of the few places left where he could still feel useful. "Henrik, you must come quickly," Greta called, breathless and pale. Emma says Mrs. Brennan means to harm herself. "We have to do something." He looked up at her, his hands streaked with dirt, and in her face saw not just fear, but that now familiar dread neither of them could name aloud. Without a word, he followed her inside. Emma was still by the kitchen window, where she had spent most of the day. Her pencil scratched steadily across the pages of her worn leather journal, as though she were recording the blooming of a flower or the shift of wind patterns, not the unraveling of a life. "Emma," Henrik said gently, "tell me what you saw." She didn't look up. Mrs. Brennan departed her house at 2:47:28 earlier than her established Tuesday pattern of 3:15. She did not turn toward the rectory. Instead, she walked toward the river. Her breathing was irregular, her gait shortened, indicators of acute distress. The probability of self-harm within a 4-hour window is currently 87%. Emma's voice was calm, detached. Not frightened, not even curious, just stating facts. Henrik stood frozen for a moment, then made a decision that surprised even himself. Without grabbing his coat, he hurried out the door and made his way toward the river, heart pounding. He found Margaret Brennan just where Emma had predicted, standing at the far edge of the dock, facing the dark water as the wind lifted her shawl. Her posture was rigid, her eyes swollen and vacant. "Mrs. Brennan," he called softly, stepping forward with care. "Are you all right?" She turned slowly, as if surfacing from a dream. "Henrik, why are you here?" "You seemed troubled," he said, choosing each word like a stone to step on. "I thought you might need company." The old woman looked away, her expression crumbling. "I can't bear the whispers, Henrik. The judgment, the shame. Father Collar says it's sin, but I can't help what I feel. I didn't ask for this." Her voice broke, and for a terrible moment, Henrik understood Emma had seen not just a deviation in behavior, but the shape of despair beneath it. And she'd been right. He stayed with Margaret Brennan for 2 long hours, sitting beside her on the edge of the dock as dusk fell and the river swallowed the light. He spoke gently, reminding her of her dignity, her resilience, her worth beyond judgment. Slowly, her breath eased. The tension in her shoulders softened, and she agreed to walk back with him. By the time he returned home, the lamps were lit and the house was quiet. Emma sat at the table, journal open, pencil in hand. Mrs. Brennan did not complete the expected outcome, she said as soon as he entered. "Your intervention altered the data set. I'll need to account for third-party variables in future calculations." Hendrik said nothing. He simply looked at her. His daughter, his 11-year-old daughter, had foreseen a suicide attempt not yet committed, and now treated the outcome as if she were updating the results of a crop yield experiment. He wanted to embrace her. He wanted to pull her away from her notebooks and tell her she was just a child. But he also knew that whatever force was at work inside her mind was no longer something they could ignore or protect her from. That night, as Emma slept without a care in her narrow bed, Hendrik and Greta sat together in the parlor in silence, lit only by the dying glow of the stove. Neither said it outright, but the decision had been made. They would leave Milwaukee. Emma's presence in the German quarter had become a curse, at least in the eyes of the community. But what troubled them more than the whispers or the avoidance was the growing realization that their daughter's strange mind was not just predicting tragedy, but pulling away from the emotions that made it human. They would find somewhere quieter, somewhere unfamiliar where Emma could grow without being feared. But deep down, Hendrik knew the truth. Emma was not finished, and the most disturbing patterns he feared were still unfolding. Because beneath the clinical voice, beneath the numbers and charts, something was shifting. The predictions were becoming more intricate, the patterns more personal, and he couldn't help but feel that his daughter was beginning to see something none of them were meant to know. She was still calculating. The final piece of Emma's revelation hit Hendrik like a physical blow. Ernst Kellner, the same man who had publicly humiliated his wife quietly, turned the community against them and tightened his grip on the brewery, was the one orchestrating the entire criminal network beneath the surface of their everyday lives. Emma continued, speaking her tone still flat clinical. I have accounted for over 24 irregular shipments, hidden transactions, and fabricated inventory reports. All originate from Ernst's office. He's the only one with access to the master ledgers. My estimates place the total theft at $47,380 conservatively. Likely more. Heinrich couldn't breathe for a moment. The room felt both frozen and burning at once. And you're sure, Emma, this isn't just speculation? Emma simply turned the journal so he could see the rest diagrams cross-referencing transactions, coded names, dates, shipping routes, income jumps, false repair invoices. It wasn't a theory. It was a prosecution brief. I started noticing it in small inconsistencies, she said. Then I started measuring their routines, documenting the overlap, analyzing the falsehoods. I checked the brewery's waste output and calculated the unrecorded batches. Then I correlated that with delivery schedules that bypassed official channels. She flipped to a final page. This is the schedule for the next 3 meetings. They'll be there again this Wednesday, May 7th at 12:04 a.m. I believe they are preparing to destroy the last of the falsified records. The accounting fire. It's almost always the final step. Hendrik sat back in his chair dazed. If this were true, and the sheer scale of data his daughter had amassed left little doubt, it meant that some of the most respected men in Milwaukee's German quarter were part of a coordinated, long-running criminal enterprise, and that the man who led the campaign to isolate the Richters had likely done so not out of morality or fear of Emma's predictions, but to silence her before she uncovered the truth. A new fear settled into Heinrich's chest. If Ernst Kellner suspected Emma had uncovered the truth, if any of them suspected, then their family wasn't just a pariah, they were a threat. He closed the journal slowly and looked at his daughter, who stared back without blinking. "We need to go to the police." Emma didn't answer right away. Then softly she said, "I already calculated that outcome." Heinrich frowned, and Emma turned the page again. Two of the men in the ring have connections inside the constable's office. One is the brother-in-law of Sergeant Horst Rudel. The other supplies the precinct with barrels. She pointed to a section marked Law Enforcement Influence, high risk of obstruction. If we go to the police now, the men will be warned. The records will vanish. The story will be turned against us. And you will be accused of putting your daughter up to it. Silence filled the kitchen like rising water. "So what do we do?" Heinrich finally whispered. Emma tapped her pencil once against the edge of the table. "We document everything. We make duplicates. We find someone outside the quarter, someone with no ties to Kellner. And we wait." "Wait for what?" Emma looked out the window as though seeing beyond the spring sun and out into the near future. For them to make one final mistake. One I've already seen coming. Outside the city of Milwaukee stirred to life on the first day of May, unaware that its greatest scandal was already written, calculated, charted, and prepared by a girl no one dared to understand. Emma had spent months compiling her observations quietly, obsessively, with the precision of someone who saw the world not in faces or emotions, but in patterns, angles, and probabilities. And now, sitting at the kitchen table with her father, her voice was steady as ever. No tremor, no fear, just data. "Papa," she said, turning the worn pages of her notebook one final time, "my calculations show a 96% probability that Mr. Kellner is behind the theft ring." Her father Heinrich felt the blood drain from his face. "Emma, these are very serious accusations. Are you sure?" She didn't hesitate. "The math is certain." And then something darker flickered across her pale face. "But there's more." Heinrich's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Kellner knows," she said simply. "He knows I've been watching him. 3 weeks ago, he came to our house at night. Twice. He stood outside for exactly 17 minutes each time, like he was deciding if I had uncovered too much." Heinrich stared at her, stunned. Emma's quiet, relentless curiosity had always unnerved him. But this was something else entirely. Not only had her strange gift for mathematics exposed a criminal conspiracy, it had painted a target on her back. She closed her journal slowly, carefully, like sealing a bomb. "Papa," she said, meeting his gaze with those eerie grey eyes, "the probability that Kellner or one of his men will act against us is 84%. The most likely time frame is within the next 72 hours. In that moment, Heinrich realized what her latest prediction meant. It wasn't about a fire or another scandal in the neighborhood. It was about them. Their lives were now a variable in someone else's equation. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the chimneys of Milwaukee's German quarter, Heinrich made a decision. He took Emma's journal and under the cover of night slipped away to the home of Dr. Matthias Müller, the town's aging physician and one of the few men he trusted. Dr. Müller had always been wary of Emma's intellect often whispering that she was born out of time. But even he was taken aback as he turned the pages by lamplight, reading her equations, charts, and predictions in silence. "Henrik," he finally said, voice low, "if this is accurate, we're not just talking about a few stolen goods. This is the largest theft operation Milwaukee has ever seen." Henrik nodded grimly. Dr. Mueller looked up, eyes narrowing. "And if Kellner suspects Emma knows, your family isn't safe here." Within hours, a plan was set in motion. Using his network of medical contacts, Mueller secured Henrik an urgent job placement at a brewery in distant Minnesota, an excuse to vanish without raising suspicion. They would leave that very night. No goodbyes, no explanations, just disappear. As the Richter family loaded their few belongings into Dr. Muller's wagon, Emma stood silently beside her father, her eyes scanning the empty street like a human compass. Then she spoke softly, but with the same unnerving clarity. "Papa, in approximately 6 months, the theft ring will be discovered. Kellner will be arrested. But 3 of the 7 men involved, they won't survive the investigation. The probabilities are very high." Henrik shivered. Even as they fled in silence, her mind was already ahead of them, projecting, calculating, knowing. And she would be right. By the first snows of winter, a federal investigation did indeed uncover the theft operation. Ernst Kellner was arrested, tried, and convicted. And as Emma predicted, 3 of his co-conspirators would die under circumstances too strange and too convenient to ever be fully explained. But on that heavy May night in 1873, as their wagon rolled past gas lamps and shuttered storefronts, all Henrik could think about was how his daughter's impossible mind had saved their lives, while erasing everything they had built. To the outside world, the Richters were simply gone. Dr. Mueller told curious neighbors that the family had received an emergency summons back to Bavaria. But quietly, he destroyed any evidence of their plans. Passenger lists, letters, addresses. Nothing pointed to where they had really gone. What the people of Milwaukee never knew was this: the Richters had fled west to a small town in Minnesota called New Ulm. There, Henrik took a job at a brewery not unlike the one he had worked at in Milwaukee. Greta, his wife, tried to reassemble their routines. Cook, clean, pray, forget. But Emma could not forget. Her mind remained as sharp, restless, and unyielding as ever. She continued tracking patterns of people of behavior of risk like a human metronome ticking toward unseen catastrophes. Dr. Mueller for a time kept in contact. In one letter, he confided that Emma had begun working quietly with a professor from the nearby college, a man fascinated by her ability to predict not just numbers, but people. And you, dear listener, might be wondering the same thing we often do at Sleepy History Tales. How much of the future can be predicted when someone sees the world purely as math? Emma Richter, the girl with storm-colored eyes and a mind made of numbers, had cracked the code of a criminal empire. But in doing so, she had lost the only place she had ever called home. And somehow, she knew that too. Professor Hermann Weiss, a reserved but sharp-minded German émigré, was the first to approach Emma's condition not as a curse or divine anomaly, but as a scientific frontier. Rather than fear her, He helped Emma make sense of her abilities, teaching her to channel her chilling insights in ways that might illuminate rather than devastate. And then, in the cold days of November 1873, a letter arrived that would forever change how her story was remembered. It was from Heinrich. Inside was Emma's final prediction, one she had written weeks earlier, long before federal agents descended on Milwaukee's German district. In eerie detail and with chilling precision, Emma had mapped out the entire brewery theft operation. Just as she had foreseen, federal authorities exposed Ernst Kellmer's conspiracy. Kellmer was arrested and later convicted for embezzling over $50,000 across multiple brewery companies, a staggering fortune for the time. His right-hand man, Wilhelm Vesper, was found dead in his study, his death officially ruled a suicide. But the whispers in the neighborhood told a different tale. Not long after Otto Steinwald died in what was described as a drunken accident, and Hermann Kreutz, well, he collapsed in his garden, his face pale, his hands trembling. Dr. Weiss called it a heart attack, but privately admitted to Heinrich that it resembled the symptoms of a rare toxin. Emma's prediction had accounted for all of it: the downfall, the deaths, the pattern of consequences. She had never left her room in Illinois, and yet her final calculations matched the unfolding tragedy in Milwaukee step by step. It was undeniable now her mind was operating at a level few could even begin to comprehend. In the aftermath, Milwaukee's German quarter began the slow, painful work of recovery. Federal investigations left scars of shame and suspicion, but they also pulled the curtain back on a rot that had festered in secret for years. New families arrived, filling the homes left, abandoned by disgrace or death. There was a sense of cautious hope, but no one ever forgot the girl with the pale face and eyes like winter stone, the one who could read your secrets as if they were numbers on a chalkboard. Parents spoke her name in hushed tones, warning children against asking too many questions. And adults? They wondered what other truths might be hiding beneath the polished exteriors of their neighbors' lives. Father Conrad, once so quick to call Emma's visions, divine, eventually admitted to Dr. Weiss that her abilities had rattled something deep inside him. He no longer believed that all knowledge was holy. Some truths, he confessed, might be too heavy for the soul to carry. Just when you think you've heard the worst, Sleepy History Tales has a way of digging deeper. If this story has unsettled you, go ahead. Send it to a friend who loves dark history. Give this video a like to help us keep uncovering the past's most disturbing corners. And if you haven't already subscribed, we have more shadows to explore. Dr. Weiss's final letter to the Richter family was dated spring 1874. Nearly a year had passed since they left Milwaukee, but he felt they deserved to know one more thing. As the investigation had unfolded, federal analysts took possession of Emma's old journal, the one Heinrich had left behind. It didn't just contain notes on the brewery theft. It held hundreds of pages of observations, coded calculations tracking the behavior of dozens of families in the German district. Daily habits, financial anomalies, social fractures, predictions of illness, death, infidelity. And in many cases, those predictions had come true. Your daughter sees what others Miss Weiss wrote. There are trained investigators who would envy her mind. And yet, I cannot help but feel relieved she is far from here. The journal was placed into evidence, but most of its contents were never made public. Even the investigators seemed unsettled by it. The last known record of Emma Richter appears not in a newspaper or police archive, but in a dusty mathematics department logbook at the newly founded Nome College, dated 1875. A brief entry by Professor Herman Weiss reads, "Private pupil, female, displays unmatched aptitude in statistical forecasting and behavioral modeling. Family relocated due to personal reasons. Further contact not maintained." And then nothing. No death record, no public marriage, no academic publications. Emma Richter vanished from the historical record as thoroughly as she had once vanished from Milwaukee on that heavy night in May of 1873. What became of her? Did the family continue moving to avoid attention? Or were there others? Families like the Richters who chose to disappear when their children exhibited talents too strange to explain. Emma's case is one of the rare moments in history where such a mind was documented with enough detail to suggest its terrifying scope. She didn't claim to see spirits or read minds. She watched, she calculated, and she understood things about people, about danger, that most of us never will. Modern science offers us some context. Today we recognize conditions like savant syndrome, certain forms of autism, or even cryptomnesia, where the brain stores and retrieves data in astonishing ways. But back then, in 1873, a girl predicting deaths from a bedroom 100 miles away might as well have been a prophet or a curse. So dear listeners, what do you believe? Was Emma's story truly over, or did her abilities stretch further than we'll ever know? Let us know in the comments, especially if you've ever met someone whose mind works in ways you can't explain. And if you're still with us, thank you. Stories like Emma's remind us that the most terrifying mysteries aren't the ones that go bump in the night, but the ones that sit quietly calculating everything hidden in plain sight. The story of Emma Richter teaches us that sometimes the most fearsome powers aren't supernatural at all. They're statistical, logical, inescapably human. And in a world where we think our secrets are safe, minds like Emma's remind us. Every pattern leaves a trace, and someone somewhere is counting.